Well, greetings and thank you for joining us for today's special Zoom webinar. This is a different topic for sure, how to order wine when you're having dinner with a donor. This topic actually came out of the donor survey, or the survey that I sent to Fundraising Tips subscribers a year ago. A number of you asked about this. It's an intimidating subject at times, but we want it to be a real positive win-win. And so I reached out to my friend Bryan Gauthier. Bryan has been a 30-year veteran of the food and beverage industry, has had his own wine enterprises, has an operation now called Our Wine Store. And I'm going to tap his special knowledge, as I have already for the past 10 years. He's taught me an enormous amount about how to enjoy wine more effectively, better. And so, Bryan Gauthier, thank you for joining us today. Again, wine at a dinner with someone, whether it's a business person or just for a social occasion, when you're handed the wine list or that menu, it can be anxiety inducing if you're just not comfortable with it. But how should we think about wine?
Yeah, Kevin, thank you very much for having me. Of course, I love to be able to share my passion for wine. And as you mentioned, I've been doing this for 35 years. I'm WSET certified, level 2 with distinction, and working on my third level currently. And um, been in the business, as you said, 35 years. I ran small wine and beer boutiques throughout DC, Maryland, and Virginia for the first 15 years of my career. And then I jumped into the high-end steakhouse world for the next 8 years and traveled all over the country, opening up high-end steakhouses, and was on their food and beverage committee, and learned a lot about food and wine pairings. And I had my own business for the last 15 years, which has been fabulous. And I get to meet great people such as yourself throughout my time, and really get to share wine and food is as a huge passion. So to be able to share food and wine is a great thing. As I've always said, people ask me, Brian, what is your favorite wine? And I say, well, I don't have a favorite wine. I have things that make my favorite wine. And I think three things are the food that I'm eating, the wine that I'm drinking, and the people I'm sharing it with. So to be able to talk to you and all your guests today about that is a really humbling and wonderful experience. So thank you for allowing me to do that today.
Well, thank you. And I just want you to riff for a bit, maybe 5 or so minutes, and then folks just join the Q&A. You can ask any question. We'll try our best to address it. We timed this for about half an hour. If we go longer, we'll just keep going. But I think we can wrap this up in a way that'll be a really good use of your time, and you can learn a lot in a compact session because Bryan is a very good teacher. Bryan, just how to start? How do we start this process, and then we'll
Yeah.
keep on going.
Well, so I'll address the question you had at the statement you made at the very beginning, and that was, when you're at a dinner with a potential donor, client, friend, whatever it may be, you go into some of these restaurants, and their wine list could be this big, thick book, or it could be even now with technology and iPad, and you're scrolling through pages and pages and pages of different wines from around the world, and you may not recognize any names on there, and which that can be very scary for anybody. It's even scary for me, and I've been in the business for 35 years. So how do I break that down, or how do I work with what I'm going to make a decision for wine? So for me, it starts basically, where am I going to eat dinner, right? Am I eating at a steakhouse, or am I eating at some place that specializes in seafood or Asian food or anything? It's kind of starting with that and the basics, okay, of pairing food and wine. If I'm going to a steakhouse, of course, the classic combination for a steakhouse is a big California Cabernet or Bordeaux or Shiraz from Australia, something big and bold and rich that will help cut through the fats of those meats and pair well with those types of flavors. If I'm going somewhere seafood, I'm going to be looking at white wines like Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. That's kind of the basics. Again, you don't want something that's going to overpower the delicate flavors of the fish that you may be eating. That being said, I worked for a company that one of the sub companies that we had a saying, "No rules, just right." And that means if you don't like Cabernet, don't drink Cabernet. Drink what you enjoy, because I don't care how great that wine is. If you don't like that pairing, it's not going to be enjoyable. So taking some of the basics of winemaking or wine pairing of doing that, and things like if you're eating spicy foods, you want to have something that's going to have sugar to it, something residual sugar. So I recommend doing, if you're doing spicy ahi tuna, doing something like a Riesling. So the sugar levels, the natural sugar levels of the wine, that sweetness will counteract the heat of the dish. If you drink a big Cabernet with that dish, same dish, while it will probably be pleasant to you on the palate, what you will notice is the heat and the spiciness of the dish will get much more intense in your mouth, and it will become more of an unpleasant flavor versus a pleasant flavor. So the basic pairings and thought process is there. But when you're entertaining guests, and you've picked this restaurant, wherever it may be, kind of doing a little bit before you're um, even get there, kind of like just like if you're asking a donor or a guest, where would you like to eat? Also, what kind of wines do you tend to drink? If they say, "Oh, I drink sweeter wines," okay, in your mind, I need to be thinking about sweeter wines like Rieslings and Gewürztraminers, things like that. Or if I like bigger red or softer reds, just kind of Pinot Noir for softer, Cabernet for bigger. That process, kind of knowing that piece of it before you even get to the restaurant is always good. When you get to the restaurant and they hand you that list, if you have some of that basic knowledge of what people are going to be eating or what style wines they tend to like, you can kind of really quickly basically X out big chunks of a menu pretty quickly. Um, I always, for groups of four or more, I always recommend trying to get a bottle of wine for a group, because everybody will probably have at least one glass, and it's a better value to get a bottle than to get individual by the glass. And to me, also, if you look at most wine lists, the most profit that a restaurant making and the least value for the consumer is their by the glass program. They tend to make more money there, as well as the most expensive bottles of wine on the list. So I tend to try to stay in that mid range of whatever the restaurant is serving. If it's mid range being $60, $70 a bottle on average, I try to target there. That's probably some of the best values you're going to find on the menu at that restaurant. So I'm always looking for that and talking to your guests about what they're eating and making decisions based on what they're eating and what they're drinking, what they like to drink. It kind of makes it a little bit easier for you as the purchaser to find a wine to drink. Once you kind of settled on that kind of basic framework of where you're at, talking to the server, or if there happens to be a sommelier or a wine buyer or wine person at the restaurant, kind of getting their feedback too, saying, "Hey, these are the things that we like. What would you recommend?" And they're going to know their list better than anybody else. But it's kind of, those are the basics that I'm always looking for when I go out to dine. I'm looking for names that I may recognize and go, okay, well, I see that they have, Robert Mondavi Cabernet for $55 on their list. Okay, I know that that's a good wine and it's solid, and $55. It's normally about $40 retail. It feels like it's a pretty good value. Let me see what other wines that are similar in descriptions. Hopefully, a restaurant may have a description brief like big, bold, rich, or food friendly descriptors with those wines. It makes it a little easier when you're making that choice of what wine you want to serve with to your guests.
What happens, someone's already asked in the Q&A, if your host is treating and they just say, "Hey, what would you like?" How do you begin to respond, especially from the standpoint of price point, but maybe even some kind of questions that you could ask in return? I
Yeah.
love the fact that you ask the host, what is it that you generally like? And you said it more in terms of style than you did in terms of particular varietals.
Correct. And so that's always a daunting thing for me. I go out a lot with clients or with friends, and they always hand me the wine list. Say, "Don't worry, we're picking up the tab. You get to choose whatever wine you want." And for me, I'm all over the place, so I'm always very cognizant of what I'm trying to do. I never pick the most expensive bottle of wine. I try to stay in the more moderate pricing. Let's say the wine list, the average, again, maybe a little bit above average. Let's say the average price was 100. I may be going to like that 125, 135, and a stylistic wines that I like. It may be, if I'm having a steak, I'm going to be looking at a California Cab. If I'm having seafood, I may be looking at a Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley, or maybe a Pinot Noir from Burgundy if they have some reasonably priced value wines there. Or kind of go off the beaten path. I'm at an Italian restaurant. I'm having veal Milanese. I'm going to be looking for a nice, beautiful Barbera or Dolcetto to kind of make that pairing with it. Did I answer that? That's the first piece.
Yeah, that's great. And again, anybody go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A. Uh, you mentioned that you could do research ahead of time.
Mhm.
If you know where you're going to eat, you can check out, you said, the wine menu online, and then you
Yeah, a
can
lot of
at least be
times
a
they
little
have
more prepared.
wine lists online, and sometimes they don't have the prices online because prices, unfortunately, in today's market, they are fluctuating a little bit, so people are a little hesitant to always have the same price. But looking online certainly, and doing your own research, and if anybody ever wants to reach out to me, you can always reach out to me and say, hey, I met you on this Q&A, and I'd love to pick your brain about wines. Kevin, I think you can send out my email contact, and I'll be more than happy to scope out anybody's wine list and give you recommendations if you give me more than 20 minutes notice to jump online and look. But yeah, if there's no prices, it's daunting, and you don't want to take advantage of anybody, or when you're going out, especially donors. You want them to feel like they're not paying, like you're just taking them out to dinner to get a great meal. So I try, if there's no prices, usually restaurants will price their wines from cheapest to most expensive, and then within that, lighter to fuller bodied. So I try to look for mid-range. Middle of those lists is where I would be if there's no prices. Trying to be cognizant of where you're at. If you're at a steakhouse, you're probably in the $150 to $200 bottle range would be an average. If you're at a seafood restaurant, you're probably a little bit less, 100 to 125, somewhere in there would be their mid-range pricing on wine.
What about if you're trying to put together a big event like a gala dinner or a reception? How do you begin to think about what kind of wine to serve, to purchase, how to even to work with the hotel in some cases? This
Yeah.
is a big, big area.
It is, and it's daunting, and unfortunately, most of these hotels, they're going to try to push their kind of quote unquote house wine on you, and those are wines that they have a huge margin. I tend to look for wines that are really crowd pleasing. So for white wines, I try to go with Sauvignon Blancs. Nothing super acidic. So I always recommend, if you're doing an event, taste with your caterer or taste with the hotel in advance, just like you would do a food tasting, is have them also do some wine pairings. So trying to find milder wines. Sometimes with Sauvignon Blanc, you can get really tropical, racy, almost really grassy style wines, and that may not be pleasing to everybody, but a Sauvignon Blanc that is a little bit milder, cleaner, crisper will work well for a Chardonnay drinker as well as a Sauvignon Blanc drinker. For reds, I try to do Pinot Noir or Merlot, something that's a little bit softer, not as bold and big for large groups. Because again, with bigger events like that, you're most likely going to have a seafood option, a chicken option, and a beef option. So you want something that will pair well with any of those dishes. Pinot Noir and Merlots tend to have enough body and weight to stand up to a nice steak, as well as not overpower, a piece of salmon or cod or whatever the dish may be for a seafood or crab. Again, it's not overpowering. It's a nice balancing power to it.
Another good question is, how do you learn more about this? I'm sure you have some recommended readings. You've been very helpful in helping me understand this
Yeah.
over the years. How would you begin to recommend we start this process?
So learning, if you don't have any wine knowledge, I highly recommend reading some books. There's two things: reading books and tasting wine. Those are the best ways to learn about wine. Reading about it will teach you the basics of how to taste wine, how to buy wine, how to taste wine, what the flavor profiles and things like that would be. But tasting is the best way to um, really put that knowledge to work. So a couple books that I always recommend is Kevin Zarley's Windows on the World, A Complete Wine Guide. I think he's been the 30th or 31st edition out now. That's about $30 on Amazon. It's a great book. It's a great way to learn. Wine Folly. She has a tasting 101 book, which is fabulous. It's like $24. We use a lot. And then, of course, one of my favorite books, even though I'm almost 50, is the Essential Scratch and Sniff Guide to Becoming a Wine Expert. And it's a great little book. It's got all the different flavors that you want. And there's actually, you can, somewhere here, you can actually scratch and smell the flavors. And I think that's really important, is learning what these flavors smell like. Because when you're talking to somebody, I really like wines with cherry or cassis, or I like baking spices. When I'm teaching young wine professionals that work for me, is we sit and go through down at the table, and we go through basically our spice cabinet to learn what are baking spices, your cinnamon smell like. Well, we all think we know, but when you sit there and smell it, the vanilla extract, smelling hazelnut, all these different flavors, when you smell them, it really kind of creates a catalog in your brain, and you go, oh, that's what I'm tasting. So it gives you a better understanding. Going out and meeting your local wine shop is a great way to learn. Doing a lot of wine shops do complimentary tastings on Fridays and Saturdays, where they have 2 to 5 wines on tasting. Going in and tasting wines with them, learning about regions, learning about the wine styles, but really tasting what all these different wines will help you better understand what type of wine you like. And I understand going into wine shops can be very daunting. They have these aisles or walls full of wine, and it may have things done by region like Chianti and, Barbera, Barolo, and then something from Lebanon. And that can be very daunting. You don't understand this, but going in and talking to them, most wine professionals, they love to talk about food and wine. They love showing you different things and tasting on things and learning your palate. You can read all you want, and you can read the critics like Wine Spectator or Wine Advocate. And I tell people that's great, and it gives you a good basis. But if your style of wines that you enjoy are not the same that reviewer likes, you're not going to like the wines that they like. Just because it got 96 points from Wine Advocate doesn't mean that 96 points is what you're going to give the wine. You could give it 58 points. I was just reading a review of a wine recently, and I was like, well, that wine sounds fabulous. And I went and tasted it. I was like, this is not a style wine that I like. I can appreciate it, but it's not a 100-point wine to me. It's a 100-point wine to that reviewer. So I tell people to kind of take that with a grain, start there and learning and tasting and seeing how your profiles, what your tastes prefer to what these reviewers are. And it's a great way to learn and kind of create an index or Rolodex of different flavors and wines that you enjoy.
Bryan, this is great, and we got some more questions in the Q&A, but what would you recommend with respect to visiting wineries? You and I happen to live in the Washington, D.C. area. Years ago, you suggested that we go out to Linden.
Yeah.
I've got my bottle of Linden Hardscrabble, one of the best things they produce. It's superb. Jim Law is sort of the godfather of a lot of Virginia wine, even wine on the East Coast. You
Yeah,
can learn a lot in that way, too. What would you
absolutely.
recommend?
So again, just like when you're stylistically wines that you like. I mean, if you're here in Virginia, yes, go see Jim Law, at Linden, go see Jeff White at Glen Manor, go down to Barbersville, Williamsburg Winery. There's some great wineries locally. If you happen to be traveling somewhere, we travel quite a bit for business. In my business, I get to go to those wine regions. But if you happen to find yourself in like Seattle or San Francisco or Portland, add a couple extra days for vacation and go down to some of these wineries. I was just in Napa last weekend, and we were with a group of people that had never been to, some of the people had never been to Napa Valley. So we took them to a couple of the bigger producers like Behringer and Freemark Abbey, to see the production process of how wines were coming in from the vineyards. We're very lucky. We were there during harvest. So there was fruit coming in. They were sorting it on the sorting table, then putting it in, doing a gentle press and getting that free run juice and going into tank. I think seeing that process of how wine is made is very important. once you've seen one tank room and sorting room, they're all pretty much the same. So then it's really finding style wineries that have produce styles of wine that you really enjoy. If you're in Willamette Valley, and you love Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, going to vineyards like Saint Innocent, Sokol Blosser, some of these smaller producers, you can find some really great values, and they'll take the time to really spend the time with you to teach you about that wine in the region. You go into some of these bigger tasting rooms where they're producing 150,000 cases or more a year. They're basically going to treat it like it's a cattle car. You're going to come in, they're going to pour you your four wines, hear what you're tasting, and that's all the information you get because they're so busy they don't have time to spend. So I like going to seeing those bigger wineries at least to see how production of wine works in that region, and then really going to smaller wineries and tasting wines at the smaller wineries where they can spend the time with you. Like if you go up to one of the wines that I happen to broker, Petrified Forest up in Knights Valley, you go to their vineyard, it's a husband and wife, and you're basically tasting in their dining room. And they'll spend all the time in the world tasting you on the wines, walking you through the vineyards and seeing how they make it and their passion. And that's an amazing way to learn about wines. And then that passion gets passed on to you, and you're going to then pass it on to your guests and your clients and your friends and everybody that you had this wonderful wine experience. And that also adds to making a donor. If you have a passion for something, that's going to make your donor or your friends, they're going to be like, wow, I really want to taste that too.
All right, here's an etiquette question that was in the Q&A. What should you do when you're offered the opportunity to taste the wine or the cork? What are some of the basic rules?
Yeah.
We can do it from the standpoint of the host or the guest. Tell us what we should do.
So if typically a restaurant, if whoever orders the wine, they're going to bring the wine, present it to you. They're going to go, here's the wine, here's the Petrified Forest, Cabernet, Nice Valley, and then they're going to open the wine. They're going to present the cork to you. When you present the cork, the best thing to do is just kind of smell the end where the wine was touching, and see if that has any off-putting smells, i.e., if it smells like wet dog or moldy or stale. That's typically the first sign that that wine is bad. They're going to pour you about an ounce of that wine in the glass for you to taste. When you taste it, you're looking for anything that may not seem pleasant. Again, that same flavors, those things that I was talking about as far as on the aromatics, you'll taste that wine and you'll know that it's not good at all. At that point, I would tell the server or sommelier, whoever came over and presented the wine, that I think this wine is flawed and have them double check. If it is flawed, they should take it off and get a new bottle, of course, right away. But tasting it's important. Before you don't want to serve a wine that's bad to your guests. So if you're the one ordering it, I highly recommend you tasting it first and make sure that the wine does meet your expectations of what the wine should be. Now, if the wine isn't big and bold enough for you, that's not really reason why to send a wine back, but it may be if the wine server or sommelier had recommended it to you. Say, this wine isn't quite what I wanted. I was hoping to get something bigger, especially if it's a recommendation. See what they say and kind of work with them on that front. And then it should be poured to the female guest first, and then the male guest second.
Another question, the Q&A is dessert wines. How do we
Yes.
think about dessert wines? Give us a quick tutorial.
So dessert wines are going to be your sweeter wines, and there's kind of several different dessert wines. You have your naturally sweet wines like Sauterne or Moscato, where they're just adding a little bit of sugar, or the grapes have been held out longer. In the case of Sauterne, it's the last thing that they harvest. The longer the fruit stays on the vine, the higher the sugar level is. And when in case of ports or Madeiras, those wines or sherry, they tend to be fortified with brandy, slows down that fermentation process and that aging process, but the alcohol goes up. It's closer to 18, 19% alcohol. For pairings for dessert wine, I tend to think of fruit wines, like Sauternes. I tend to think of like fruit dishes or things with ice cream. Like a apple pie with Sauterne is fabulous. When I think of ports and Madeiras, I kind of want something like sweet and salty combination. So the classic pairing with port would be doing chocolate and figs and blue cheese. So you get that sweetness, you get a little bit of tartness from the and acidity from the chocolate, and then you get that saltiness from the blue cheese. So it's a nice combination to play off of.
All right. Well, we got a number of questions that keep popping up in the Q&A, and if
Yeah.
folks need to drop off at the bottom of the hour, we understand, but we're going to try to address all these questions as best we can. If you have not a dinner that you're hosting, just a reception, how do you think differently about those wines that you serve?
So if it's just a reception, I'm thinking lighter wines. Again, I'm thinking Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Grigio, Pinot Noir, lighter wines that aren't too heavy, and they tend to be a little bit lower in alcohol for receptions. I don't want something that's full blast, 16% alcohol. Guests will, especially if you don't have any food, it doesn't really work as balanced. So I'm typically looking for lighter style wines in that case.
Great. What are some things to think about how to, of what the question is, any lessons on what to avoid with respect to wine or wine tasting?
So avoid, huh? I don't try. I try to taste everything. To me, the only way you're ever going to learn whether you like something or not is tasting everything. So I never say no to tasting things, unless it's kind of things like, and no offense to anybody that drinks it, Barefoot Chardonnay or Yellowtail, these really big mass production wines. I tend to stay away from those because I don't know the process to make that much wine. They're probably using some type of fertilizers in the vineyards. So the quality, I'm sorry, I think some of those fertilizer chemicals can get into the wine, even though they don't say it does. I tend to stick with wines that are more organic and or biodynamic wines where they're not using fertilizers, they're not using pesticides or herbicides in the vineyard. So I tend to smaller production wines. I stay away from these big mass production wines.
All right, last question. This is a great one. Let's say you've been invited to dinner at a donor's home, or it could be
Yeah.
at anybody's home. How do you think about what wine to take as a gift?
So gift wine. So yes, this is always a challenge. So one of the things it sometimes a guest doesn't want to has already picked out their wines that they're or the donors picked out wines or whoever you're visiting has already picked out wine. So in that case, I tend to bring something if I know the guest well. I try to find out. I kind of have an idea what they drink already. But if I don't know what they like, I tend to go with things that are safe. Champagne is always a good gift for people. If you don't know what they like, most people enjoy a sparkling wine. It's a great way to start off a celebration. If you don't want them to drink it right then and there, don't bring it chilled. That way, they're not tempted to open it right away. If you want them to drink it right away, then bring it chilled so it's ready to go and you can pop it. It's a great way to start off any evening or finish any evening off. A bottle of champagne is always a safe bet. Unless you know that they don't like sparkling wine, or if you know that they like California Cabernets, and then trying to find a California Cabernet that is within what you feel comfortable in spending, and buying that and bringing a Cabernet or Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. Those tend to be varietals that most people know and enjoy.
All right, Brian, this has been terrific. Last question,
Yeah.
how to use rating services, whether it's your iPhone and you take a picture of the label and it gives you kind of a crowdsourced recommendation, or even looking at the Robert Parker recommendations or whatever it may be. How do you use that to determine what you might purchase?
So for me, I don't buy anything that I haven't tried personally at least once or twice. Every selection that we carry on our website or in my stores or anything like that, I've always tasted it. But that being said, if I'm looking for new wines or new wine regions, I'm reading some of the trades to see what they're like, whether it be Parker or Spectator, kind of what regions they're highlighting. I don't really read their ratings. But if I'm looking to see if a wine's really popular, or if I look at two different apps. I use Cellar Tracker personally. I track all my own wines in my own cellar using Cellar Tracker, and there's a lot of feedback from users of Cellar Tracker that have had those wines. So you can take a picture of a bottle of wine, and it will basically through AI. I don't understand all this technology stuff. It will recognize the label and say, "Oh, this wine's in our system. What vintage do you have? Here's all the professional scores that have been given to it, and here's all the scores that people that have bought those wines or have had those wines and taste them. These are their own personal reviews and notes on those wines. So I kind of skim through both and kind of see, are these flavor profiles things that I like or don't like? Are these wines popular? Is it as a I've been on a kick right now of Lebanese wines and doing an in-depth kind of tracking to see all these different Lebanese wines, and so I read other people's notes to find out more about those. So I kind of use a variety, but Cellar Tracker, Vivino, both are great. Wine.com, they all have really good apps where you can get pretty basic, good descriptions, either winemakers' descriptions, a reviewer's description, or a crowdsourcing description of Cellar Tracker. Definitely more crowdsourcing description of all the people that bought that wine.
Great. Well, the last comment that I just got was bravo, Brian. This has been really informative. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
I'll send an email out to everybody who joined today with some of the recommended reading that Brian offered. But Brian, tell us how we can follow you on social media and learn more.
Absolutely. So you can follow us on all the four major ones that we're on social media: TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Is just look for OWS Wine on all of those. Oakton Wine Shop on Twitter is a great way to find us on social media. Follow us at owswine.com is my website. And you can, of course, email me, Bryan, Bryan, at owswine.com. And I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you may have, help you with anything. Just refer to this session. You know Kevin Gentry, and the world will be opened up to you.
Well, thank you very much for giving us your time today. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Hope this becomes a better experience, a win-win when you're dining the next time with a generous donor and wine is involved. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Kevin. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.